Hey everyone, I'm Anthony Gutierrez with Common Cause Texas and the Fair Maps Texas Coalition. We are so excited for this discussion. We're going to be starting in about 10 minutes today. I just want to let you know the chat is open. If you want to throw some questions in for our amazing panelists, you can do that now. And we will be getting started soon. Talk to you in a minute. Hello again, everybody. Anthony Gutierrez. We are going to be getting started here in just about 2 minutes. And again, feel free to drop questions in the chat if you have any for our amazing panelists. Talk to you in a minute. Hey, y'all. Thank you for joining us for this discussion of the Slay the Dragon film and panel discussion with some amazing panelists. I'm going to introduce them in just a minute. But first, I just wanted to thank you for joining us on behalf of the Fair Maps Texas Coalition and Participant Media. And from Participant Media, I just want to first kick this over to our friend Delvin.
Thank you all so much for being here. We're so excited to have this conversation. We are grateful to be partnering with Fair Maps to really host this conversation. Participant is a company that was founded 15 years ago by Chairman Jeff Skoll, and we are a media company really dedicated to entertainment that inspires audiences to engage in positive social change. So I hope you had the chance to see the documentary. It was from directors Barrett Goodman and Chris Durrance, and it really shines a light on gerrymandering, the practice of really redrawing electoral maps to serve a single party, and that is a threat to our democracy. So if you had a chance to see the film, it follows a handful of citizens groups in the state of Michigan as well as Wisconsin, outraged by what they see as an attack on the core democratic principle that every person's vote counts, and it should count equally. And so the documentary does a good job of following that, and I'm excited for you to talk to and hear from the film subject, Katie Fahey, today. So alongside the film, we launched the Slay the Dragon campaign, and this really was meant to increase awareness of gerrymandering and really catalyze all citizens across the country to participate in a more fair and equitable electoral system. You can find out more information at participant.com/slaythedragon. Again, thank you so much to Fair Maps Texas, and thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Delvin. So just really quickly, I am going to talk very quickly and then kick this over and bring in our panelists who we are going to spend the bulk of this conversation talking to. Just to sort of get us started, I just wanted to say I watched this film first. It was probably like a month and a half ago. It was like pre-pandemic in the before times, right? And I watched it again last night just to rewatch it to make sure I was prepared for the panel. And the very first frame, I guess, it had the quote from John Adams that was, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." And seeing that as we sort of going through and fighting with all of these things and grappling with all these things that are going on in our society right now, that really slaps you in the face, right? Like we are all just thinking about inequity in all kinds of aspects. But when we think about what the problems are with our democracy right now, and the fact that our democracy is not just a given, a thing that we have to fight for and the thing that we have to protect, the discussion we're having today is really core to that. It's really a discussion about like, what are some of these fundamental problems with our democracy and how do we fix them? Thankfully, to get into these questions and hopefully give us some answers, we have two just amazing panelists. First, if you saw the film, you are familiar with Katie Fahey. This is going to sound incredibly nerdy. For those of us who work in the democracy reform kind of world, working on voting rights and money in politics, campaign finance, like Katie Fahey is a legit like big celebrity. Like if you're making your list of like who should we get to talk about redistricting stuff, like well, there's Katie Fahey, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, like it's a short list, but Katie's always on that list. You saw her story in the film. I'll let her like talk about it more in a minute here. She is now the executive director of The People. And we're definitely going to talk about that and just kind of what they do and what Katie's up to now. Also with us, my very dear friend, State Representative Dr. Mary González. Mary represents a part of El Paso where a lot of my family live. She is someone I've followed for a really long time. We got to know each other when she first ran for office, which still feels to me like it was yesterday. I'm realizing now it was a while ago, and she's now a pretty senior member of the legislature. I was trying to make notes real quick on her bio to like make sure I mentioned some of the like key things about Mary, and I started making a list of like all of the national publications that always mention Mary as like the up and comers and people to watch and people who are going to be huge like national leaders on a bigger stage at some point. And the list was really super long, but just trust me, like a person to keep an eye on who has done incredible things in Texas. And I think the most important thing about Mary, for the purposes of this discussion, for those of us in Texas in the Fair Maps Coalition, and even more broadly that work on like voting rights and just democracy issues, she is always a legislator that we can count on to go to, who's not just like gonna be on our side and be a reliable vote for our bills. She's someone who will really fight for our issues, who will champion our issues. Whether it's carrying the Independent Redistricting Commission bill in the last legislative session, or being one of the leading voices fighting when we had a Secretary of State trying to purge naturalized citizens from our voter rolls. Like Mary is just somebody who was always in this fight and always a powerful advocate for us. So thank both of you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Anthony. Those are super kind words. And Katie, I'm super excited to be on this panel with you. I'm, like I was mentioning earlier, I'm your biggest fan.
Or me.
Yes, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, so Katie, let's start with you. I mean, most of us, we either just saw the film or just rewatched it. It was your story there. It's just, I mean, there's so many kind of interwoven stories, but it's really obviously the core, the heart of the film is that personal story. That's just, it's so powerful sort of seeing you like get so excited about the getting the signatures to get on the ballot, and then there's like this really personal moment later where like you can just feel the sort of the weight of like, I think you've just gotten sued, and it's just like, oh, like expectations, and then all the way through to election night. Like the campaign itself had to be so just like, I don't even know the words for it, but to experience the campaign at the same time that it looks like somewhere in there, like a documentary crew starts following you around, like you just like, what was that like?
Yeah, the campaign was 100% a roller coaster, up and down, up and down. And the documentary crew, Arc Media, they actually us pretty early on. There was a professor in Michigan at Wayne State University named Dr. Kevin Deegan Krause. He had videos explaining gerrymandering that were really good. So the crew ended up meeting him, and then he was like, "You've got to meet this group that's going around our state trying to end gerrymandering. They're absolutely wonderful." And then I think when the crew first met us, like a lot of the people who are portrayed in the film, I think they were like, "Really seems like this is not how it's normally done. You guys don't have a really strong sense, but you know, you sure have a lot of enthusiasm and creativity. So we'll start following you around." And for us, when we were trying to figure out how do regular citizens come together to do this, there just weren't a lot of examples of anyone or groups who had. And we decided, okay, let's let this film crew follow us around so that hopefully whether we win or we lose, other people can at least see what it looks like to try and start taking on some things like gerrymandering or doing a constitutional amendment. It certainly doesn't cover everything, but it is really fun even for me to be able to relive those moments.
Yeah, that's awesome. And can you, so just like as by way of an update, like after the credits rolled, so what happened after that? Like with Michigan redistricting and with you, I know you're now with the people, like what's going on with redistricting and what's going on with you?
Yeah, well, almost immediately the legislature tried to basically manipulate our bill. They tried to make it so that the Secretary of State's office, which handles all elections in Michigan, would not be able to actually facilitate the process of having the commission fall under their department. So even though we were tired and it was hopping into the holiday season, we called up and we started talking to all of our legislators and made sure we could defeat that. The other thing that they went to try and do was make the ballot initiative process even harder. So in Michigan, we are lucky, like about 26 states around the country, the constitutional which gather a lot of signatures, then the citizens of our state can directly vote on a constitutional amendment. And that was really hard for us, even though we did it with all volunteers. But they tried to make that even harder. They also brought lawsuits against us saying that with our commission, if you are like directly a legislator, immediately related, or a registered lobbyist, you can't serve on that commission. You're allowed to submit feedback. You're allowed to say how you'd like the lines to be drawn, but you don't get the people actually holding the pen. And they said that, you know, that was illegal and discriminatory against our politicians from not being able to choose their voters, I guess. And they've tried to sue us, but so far, every single time, we have still won in court, which has been very exciting. The cases keep getting dismissed. They keep saying they are without merit. But of course, they're going to try and do anything they can. On the other end, though, what's really exciting is we have a really fabulous Secretary of State who's fully embraced wanting to make sure that as many Michiganders can participate in this new process as possible. And so applicants have opened to identify who the 13 member commission will be. I know that there's been over 7,000 applications that have already been submitted. And soon we should be narrowing that down and seeing who some of the finalists will be. After that, that commission will go around the state and make sure to listen to people across our state and what they want to decide on, how their communities should look. And we're really excited to have this be our first time. And then for me, like I was kind of mentioning before, figuring out how to navigate the political process is really hard. And we created a lot of tools from scratch. We learned a lot of lessons. We met a lot of people. And so we started an organization, and we're in the shirt of the people, so that we could take those lessons that we learned and pay it forward to other people who in their states are looking to want to end gerrymandering or work on some kind of other systemic democracy reform. We help them find other people who want to do that, get access to tools and resources, and then we help them champion it.
That's amazing. Awesome. Well, so Mary, let me, one of the, I think, important, just kind of, there's a couple, I think, important, just framing questions that a lot of people asked about. I think a good place to start as far as like looking at Katie's amazing story and like, how do you do that in Texas? like I think one of the right. Right, so we're just real soft.
Don't start with the hard questions or anything, you know.
So this is actually pretty okay. Let's just talk about. I think a lot of people who are not like super engaged in politics, in Texas politics, might not know just kind of like the history of just like Texas and voting rights and all of the like voter ID and redistricting and the Secretary of State deal. Like, can you just like a quick overview of like what is it? I know you. These are things you work on a bunch as like the vice chair of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus, and you all do amazing work there. Is that the thing you can just sort of talk a little bit about, just like Texas and voting rights and redistricting, like?
Yeah. So Texas has a history of voter suppression. We as decades, we can go back decades, everything from voter ID to redistricting and gerrymandering, to kicking people off the ballot rolls, like you said. But like we can even look at very simple things. So for example, right now, we do not allow for people to do online voter registration. We, in fact, we make it very difficult to register to vote. It doesn't have to be that way, right? We can choose to have a system, a process that is easy and accessible, and so encourages people to get involved in the democratic process. That's not what we have in Texas. So what I always, when I go around the state talking to young people, I give this example about online voter registration. We can literally do everything online, but we cannot vote. We can check our banking, we can send money, we can do all these things, but we cannot register online to vote. And I ask them a question. Do you feel it is intentional or unintentional? Because if we start to unpack these dynamics, we can see the intentionality around it, and it's a example of the historical realities of Texas having this history of voter suppression, whether it's the Voter ID Act, whether it was kicking people off the rolls, whether it was gerrymandering. I mean, we can go back all the way to the 1970s when Texas was required to then, because of the gerrymandering, to go through pre-clearance. So it's a history of it. And so, but what's most important for people today, and I would say even the youth today who are great at organizing right now, is to understand and to internalize that there are intentional forces trying to limit voter participation and engagement in Texas right now. So if we want to change things, we're going to have to definitely go over those barriers.
That's a great point. Yeah. Well, one question that we got a lot from people who were RSVPing had to do with a similar thing, and I think this is a good question for both of you. And I guess I'll start with you, Katie. The question is basically like, you know, there's massive opposition in the country to the concept of gerrymandering, but it's also something that's kind of wonky, right? Like it's kind of hard to put into human terms. I think the film does an incredible job of talking about it in the context of the Flint water crisis, and really connecting the dots for people. But like, you know, maybe in the context of like what's happening in the world today, like, and then maybe you might be able to talk about this more in Texas. But Mary, like, can y'all just talk about like how do you talk to people and make them care about gerrymandering when there's, you know, other things going on today that feels like oh God, the world's on fire. Like it's hard to care about this, you know, kind of wonky democracy issue.
Terms aren't working anymore. That voting is, of course, super important, but even when you can vote people who are really great into office, you don't always still see results and actual change in your community. What we saw in Michigan is it didn't matter if you voted red, blue, green, purple, in between. You weren't happy with the state of politics. That's how we started almost every conversation. Are you happy with the state of politics? And pretty much the resounding unity in Michigan was no. None of us are really happy. People blamed one side or the other side, but they really did feel like the system's rigged. It's rigged so that special interests get more of a say than constituents, even though our government is supposed to be getting its consent being derived from us, the people. And I think that's one way that people can start the conversation. Not everybody knows about gerrymandering, but they do have this sense that the system isn't designed to work for me. Then all you have to do is show them a picture, even of where they live, and say, is this how you think representative democracy should look? I know for us, we have communities that are literally carved in half. Near my house where I live right now, there's one street, it's 6 houses long, and there are 3 different Michigan house districts along that one street. Those kids all use the same roads, they go on the same bus, they have the same concerns, yet if they had a major issue that they needed to talk to their legislator about, they'd actually have to go talk to 3 different people and hope one of them pays attention. So I think that's a good place to start. I think being able to work on systems fixes, going to that root cause, and even to the basis of like, here is how we are supposed to be able to advocate to a representative who's going to make sure that we're heard in our state capitol and in Washington, D.C., that can help solve those other issues. A lot of times when you're running into things like water quality or school systems or racial inequity, those things our government isn't set up well to solve, because right now the rules of the game make it so that special interests help you get reelected, or voting with somebody who's from a different party is going to help you get primaried out. And so collaboration, wanting to work, actually not incentivized for politicians to get elected if they don't work together. And gerrymandering is huge for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the center of the question of even this documentary. We have to help people. We have to encourage people to understand the topic, or else we're never going to be able to create the movement we need in order for this to change. So here's what I think this moment in time has really opened the eyes to a lot of people: is the systemic realities that exist in society. That these things don't or do not exist by accident or by happenstance. And I think once we start to show all of these systems, it's easier than to show, well, redistricting is not immune from the realities that exist in society of power dynamics. And I would also say that not only are they not immune, but with the incorporation or the increase of technology, we see how they are magnified or even fast forwarded. And that's really what we've been seeing. But again, I'll give an example. I represent 200,000 people, and in my last primary, only 4,800 people voted. We just have a democracy problem from the ground up. And people ask me, well, why aren't people voting, Mary? And I think there's a lot of historical reasons. In my district, it's one of the top 10 poorest districts in the state. For decades, for generations, there have been intentional forces encouraging people not to be involved, to distrust their elected officials, and there's some truth to that. But there's a lot of things that have happened that have really led to the breakdown of democracy. I give lots of talks, and I've talked about the talks I give in classrooms. As a former professor, I love going back to classrooms and talking. But I ask them 5 questions. The first question is a pop culture question, which I inevitably never know the answer. Like, who is playing the Cowboys? Because El Paso is a big Cowboys city. So, and all the kids, all the students know the answer. I never, ever know, but they know. Then I ask them a question: who's the governor of Texas? And then I ask, who's the lieutenant governor of Texas? And both times, the governor, maybe they know. Sometimes they still say Rick Perry. They never know the lieutenant governor. And then I ask, who is the politically most powerful person in Texas? And they just have no idea. And we talk about it, and I say, in my opinion, it's the lieutenant governor, but we can debate that all day long. But the 5th question is the most important. I said, okay, you knew the answer to the first question. So it's not that you can't know names or dates or information. It's that you're not given this information. Again, why? Let's unpack that. And I'm not trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I do think we have to be cognizant of the realities that society is structured to maintain dynamics of power, and it has been historically, and we have to start to recognize that, because until we start to do that, people aren't going to be able to connect the dots. So as we do these larger conversations, then we can talk about gerrymandering, and I think it starts to make a lot of sense. But we're talking about, specifically in communities of color, intentional efforts for generations to not give this information. And so what frustrates me about Texas is a lot of times national groups come in and spend $1 million for 3 months or 6 months and like, oh, we're going to change what politics looks like in Texas. To change what politics looks like, and that's why I love Katie's story in the documentary, it is like a long-term effort. It is years, and we have to be able to do that investment and know that it's going to take a long time and be okay with that.
That's a great point. Yeah. To stick with you for just a second, Mary. So there was a Houston Chronicle piece just recently that was talking about a study, and it highlighted Texas specifically. And this is touched on in the film too, but basically just talked about like how partisanship and like the partisan divide has driven the ideology and driven like what is actually happening in legislatures. Basically saying like if all that legislators care about is their primary, those issues are going to be the only things that, I mean, do you feel like in your time in the legislature over the last few sessions, like, I mean, when you think about what have been the big issues that have dominated the last 3 or 4 sessions, like, is that a phenomenon of like just Republican Party primary politics, basically, or like what do you think?
Oh, completely. And I'll give an example. When I was a first-term legislator, because you were talking about how old I am, thanks, Anthony. We love you too. That was nearly 10 years ago when I came into the legislature. Me and another Republican Tea Party member were working on an ethics bill when it came to running for office. Ethics, that is not a partisan issue. But nevertheless, when I came back home, people in my district were very proud of me. Like, oh, Mary, we're glad you worked with the Republican on this issue. But when he went back home, it was like, we can't believe you work with that liberal Mary González. Like, what are you thinking? And he got some backlash. Luckily, him and I have been able to continue to work together, but it was unfortunate that he had that experience. Now, fast forward 10 more years to where we are at now, a lot of our political agenda, even down to our speaker races, have been dominated by Republican primary conversations. And so in order for democracy to work, we have to have balance. And unfortunately, the gerrymandering that does exist does not allow for balance. And so it creates an imbalance, whether of the 150 members, of a super majority. Like when I came in, there were 99 Republicans to 51 Democrats. We really didn't even have to show up, and it was like that imbalance really does a disservice to Texas and to democracy. But it's also the imbalance that you see again through the primary system and really the issues that get brought up. But yes, to simply answer your question, Anthony, is the political agenda in Texas very much determined by primary politics? Completely, 1,000% yes.
Yeah, which is basically the case in Congress as well, but you know, little magnified, I guess, maybe in Texas politics.
Well, and it's sad because Texas wasn't always like this, right? Texas was really known for a lot of the way our institutions are structured, for a lot of bipartisan work. And I'm still grateful that Texas does have a bipartisan aura because the speaker still elects somebody in the minority party to chairmanships, or we see our house allows for people who are of both parties to sit next to each other. So there's still elements of bipartisan efforts, but imagine how much more we'd work together if primaries weren't dictating the agenda.
Absolutely. Well, I definitely want to circle back to this because the especially if you're having this discussion in Texas, the like, how do we bridge that divide and get Republicans on board with some of these things? That needs to be part of the conversation. But before we get to that, I also just let's jump back over to Katie. When we're talking about like the things that we need to talk them into getting on board with, like what are those things? Like I know you do. You said this is like the 3rd one of these you're doing just this weekend. I know you do a ton of speaking on this topic about like winning reform and ending gerrymandering. Can you just sort of like talk about like what are the different ways that people are approaching this problem, like in the courts, grassroots stuff, like legislatively, like how are people getting at this around the country?
Sure. Yeah, there's probably 2 parts to answer the question. So the first is, if you want to actually change the way the lines are drawn, you're normally looking at who is going to draw those lines, how are the lines going to be drawn, like what are the criteria that are going to be put in place? Are you allowed to give a disproportionate political advantage? Are you going to just make it about competitiveness? Are you going to make it about existing boundaries? And the third is, what does the process actually look like? Are people invited into it? Are there public hearings? How is that testimony used? Is all data used in the process have to be made available and live quickly? What we see around best practices are really high participation and visibility to the public. It's a very transparent process. And that ideally, you're not having politicians who are in office choosing who their voters are going to be. Ideally, you have some other group that is drawing those lines. And the criteria often is about communities of interest, keeping equal population, and making an effective district that reflects the balance of how voters actually vote. So, like I said, there's a good amount, 20-something, that have a ballot initiative process where if you write constitutional language, gather a bunch of signatures, you can then go put it up for the voters. So in Michigan, you saw that we did that. That isn't an option. So you can look at the maps already drawn, and if you see and feel like there's a pretty strong case to be made, either communities were targeted because of the color of their skin or because of how they vote, and those were purposely trying to be suppressed, you can sue. You can sue to say that those maps were gerrymandered. Now, right now, because in 2021, those map lines are being redrawn, not a lot of new lawsuits are being brought because there aren't that many election cycles that will be impacted once if the maps were to get down. Actually, in Michigan, they pretty much said like, oh no, it's too late to be able to even impact the current map. But once these new maps out in 2021, that would be a great place to start. Then the third option is to actually work with your legislature to ask them to make nonpartisan redistricting a priority and to make sure that they have some kind of new law. What's really in Virginia, they actually, over the past 3 years, the Republican-controlled House and Senate had to decide on a gerrymandering, an anti-gerrymandering independent commission, and then during the midterms, the Democrats came back into power in Virginia, and so they had the ability to say, well, are we going to do that? Or now that it's our turn, do we want to gerrymander? And they decided, nope, you know what? Let's stick with this language that's already been written to have an independent commission, or like a mix of a politician and with regular citizens. And now it's actually put up voters there. So in some states, there's lots of people being able to work that way too. With lines being drawn right now, if you don't have time in your state to change how these lines might be drawn, you see a lot of people making sure that they're going to be a part of that process. Now that they know what gerrymandering is, they can go and talk to their legislators. There's so many offices and elected positions up in 2020. So this is going to be a big election year. And so people are asking people who are running for office, what are you going to do about redistricting? What is that going to look like in our state? Are you going to allow gerrymandering? Instead, how are you going to make sure that you'll prevent it? You also have people who are looking to be able to prepare themselves and their community to go and testify while these maps are being drawn. Because if the legislature ends up ignoring that afterwards, you then have evidence that they purposely drew these lines not based on the community, but for something else, which can help a lawsuit later.
Yeah. And can I ask you about the Virginia example? Like for us in Texas, we paid a ton of attention to that because that seems like most likely the path you would have to go to win reform in Texas. There's been kind of this theory that we keep talking about, and it's like being talked about a lot more now because it sounds like there's a really good chance that Democrats in Texas will take over the state house and maybe make things really competitive at the statewide level. Like, do you feel like the reason that happened in the legislature and they were okay getting on board with that, like both sides were okay getting on board with an independent commission there, was it because they both sort of saw like, well, we're in this like moment of like power sort of like shifting and kind of being a little bit of a purple state, and neither one of us is like
I think it was a strong part of it. Yeah, I think it was kind of that golden rule of like unto yourself as you want others to do unto you, or whatever that is. Like, I feel like they were looking ahead saying, well, we just got away with this, but we don't really want it to happen to us depending on how the voters vote. And so why don't we create something that's just going to be fair? What's interesting is they did still keep legislators pretty involved in the process, but it does do a lot to curb gerrymandering, which is really important. And for the first time ever, citizens will be invited to the table. So I don't know that they got the strongest version for reform that they could. But I think, yeah, that's what it was. And then even for the Democrats, actually, though, they, up until literally the last hour of session, seemed like they were going to kill it. They were just going to gerrymander full state. But the difference, there were thousands of Virginians who were calling, who were showing up at that session, who were making sure that they knew that they had been fighting for those fair maps, and they had been for years too. So I don't want to underplay actually the key role that citizens play, showing that when they show up, it really can matter. Even though Michigan was different, we had a Supreme Court, and you saw them in the film where it was very stressful. But something that's always, there was a news story, it's not covered in the documentary, that came out showing that one of the key judges who would be deciding, she was up for election for the very first time, and she was getting political pressure saying that she'd be dropped from her fundraising team and that her party might not nominate her to be a Supreme Court justice if she voted to keep us on the ballot. And so we were going into that with this very real knowledge of like direct manipulation, where people were asking her to not make decisions based on our Constitution, but instead political parties. We ended up filling that whole courtroom, which you do see. And then outside, we actually had 400 people at a rally. And they ended up keeping us on the ballot, as you also saw in the movie. I actually got to talk to some of those justices afterwards, and they said that the only day in Michigan that the Supreme Court was filled was the day they heard the gerrymandering case. And they said, don't think we didn't notice. It was very clear that these were real people trying to change their constitution, because that's what the people wanted. And that's what our government is trying to. Actually, I was looking at the Texas Constitution that opens like the Michigan Constitution, which is all political power is inherent in the people. And I think that's something that for everybody, no matter what state you're living in, remembering that power and making sure you're bringing it there to these fights. Legislators might end up getting elected and then playing the game, but most of them did not go into office because they just want to be a party hack. A lot of actually have, really wanting to work with their community. And so I think helping give them the confidence and the ability to do that is really important.
Yeah, and I can't believe none of us in Texas ever connected the dots between the introduction to our Constitution and the thing, and that's mentioned, 50 times in the film. Like, I feel like next legislative session, we're going to put that on posters and just like, that's important. All right, Mary, I'm gonna. Okay, Mary, I apologize in advance for this question. There's not really, I'll preface it with, I know there's not really like a definitive answer, but with the the delay of census data coming to Texas, how is Texas like, okay, how does redistricting normally work in Texas? How is it probably going to work in 2021?
Yeah. Redistricting is always, let me just say this. We have been talking about redistricting for the last 4 years. Like, legislators have been really, it is something that we really think about. Because like Katie explains, like there's so many levels to this. Like, normally we would get normally at this time period, our legislative redistricting committee would be going across the state holding hearings. Obviously, we're not doing that right now because of coronavirus. Then, when we would get into session, which starts in January of an odd number year, the committee, we would elect a new speaker, and then there would be a new committee, and that committee would come up with maps. The maps would then be go through the committee hearing process, and then it would come to the floor and we would vote on it after we got the census data in April. So a lot of this is very, very quick. And one of the things that we have been talking about specifically to my constituents, because they really want to get involved in redistricting because of we're a rural district, and that rural district is there's quite that we're going to lose rural seats, and so there's a lot of like conversations in rural communities about what redistricting looks like right now. Which I actually have a solution, Anthony, that's really radical, like super radical. And then you can ask me later. But so anyways, here's the point. The timeline's very strict. We do the hearings, we do January, we come in, we have the bill going to the committee. By April, when we get the census data, we're able to finally finalize the bills, move it out by end of May. And I mean, it has to happen very, very quickly. And if you know anything about the legislative process, it's really hard to get bills through. And so that's a very strict timeline. With everything happening with the coronavirus, we're not having committee hearings. We're not, we also don't know how elections are going to turn out, so we have less of an idea who's going to be in leadership. So we don't know who's going to be the chair. There's a lot of questions on these things. And then to top it off, we won't have the census data in time. There's a lot of predictions of what could possibly happen. For example, what we do think will happen, the Texas Constitution says that you're required to do redistricting in the next regular session after you get the census data or during the census data. So since we were not going to get it until after we're out of session, technically we wouldn't be required to do it by Texas Constitution until the next session. Now, what we're hoping is that Congress, if they haven't technically allowed yet for the census data to reach our states late yet, that they'll put some bounds on that. That they'll say you must do redistricting in the year that you get it, so that it requires and forces Texas to have a special session going in to do redistricting. However, what people don't realize is, and I think it's really difficult, is that even if the House is Democratic and the Senate is Republican, this still will be an imbalance, because the maps will and still have to go to the Legislative Review Board, which is 5 statewide office holders, which are all Republican, unless the Speaker is a Democrat. So it's a long process. What I do think is going to happen is we're going to do it in a special session. That means 30 days to get it done, unless we have more special sessions. But I think that we have to warn people that there's upcoming chaos, because I think people get disenchanted with chaos and they're like, oh, it's too crazy, I'm not going to get involved. It's going to be chaos. Let's own that, but let's still be involved. Don't let the chaos scare you, people. Like Katie says, we need your voice. So it's still an opportunity for us to get stuff done.
So still an opportunity to get things done, and maybe more of an opportunity, like for us, like the people that are working on reform in Texas, like when the bills we were working on didn't pass in the last legislative session, we sort of figured like, well, the next session is the redistricting session. Like, you can't pass a bill that's going to affect what happens during that session. But if we're going to have a special session and then maybe also redrawing in 2023, like, does that mean, tell me if I'm right about this, does that mean that we can maybe pass a bill in 2021 to create an independent commission or do other things that will affect the drawing in the that going forward?
There's a lot of details to that question, but ultimately, yes, in theory, you could, right? So you want to make sure that the enacting clause is earlier than before you would start redistricting, and quote unquote, but it does give us some leeway to reform some redistricting work going into, and even in a great way, I would say, Anthony, and I haven't talked to you about this before, so sorry for surprising you, but maybe if there's a good possibility, because every single time Texas has done maps, they have been reprimanded by the courts, right? Every single time for the last few decades. So you could put a legislation through that says if they come back from the courts, then it triggers an independent commission, right? That would give us the opportunity to use it going into 2023, 2025. I don't know, just an idea I literally thought of when Katie was talking.
That is super smart, and we are going to call your office to write that bill Monday.
Okay. This is how we make bills, people.
This is how laws are made. But it actually, it raises another really smart idea that was not mine. I stole from somebody who I think stole from Ohio, that I was going to suggest to you, and I forgot to talk to you about this also. So sorry. But so I believe what they did in Ohio was basically like through like parliamentary rules, like said like the passage of redistricting plans required a supermajority, which meant because of the partisan makeup, like one party couldn't ram it through, right? So like, it's obviously going to be really hard to pass a bill, like, but maybe a creative way to get at this. Maybe we could in the House pass a House rule that required, like, do you feel like that's a viable thing that could maybe happen?
Oh, I definitely think that's a viable thing, especially because I think there'll be some interesting coalitions. Like, it's not super partisan, like Katie said. Like, for example, rural legislators, rural Democrats and rural Republicans will tend to come together, right? And so, and you'll see like these groups come together. So I do think a rule change would be possible. We already have those rules for using the rainy day fund, for constitutional amendments. So that actually is a really great idea, Anthony. Thanks you for surprising me with that one. Well, imagine if I thought it was a bad idea, I have to call you out in public.
Mayor and I have done a few of these in the past with a guy from the Brennan Center named Michael Lee. It was his idea. Credit to him. I'm not going to pretend like I thought of that. Well, so let's, and again, just for the people watching, you can still drop questions into the chat. There's a ton in there, and I'm trying to get to everything. I guess one thing I want to make absolutely sure we do before we wrap up or get too close to the end here. There are so many questions about what people can do. And I just want to give you 3 quick things that the Fair Maps Texas Coalition is working on. Or has that you can do, and they're all on the event page that you RSVP'd for here. And I think there's some people from the Fair Maps Coalition who are dropping stuff in the chat who can hopefully just drop that link in there. One thing is just simply signing up for our newsletter, the Fair Maps Texas newsletter. And I know sign up for a newsletter sounds like a lame action, but the what you can do that's going to be effective, like literally seems like it's changing, day to day, week to week. Like right now, there are so many things we're doing related to this pandemic where we're trying to push the redistricting committee to be able to do field hearings virtually, which right now is not a thing that they're doing. It's unclear whether or not they're going to be allowed to do it unless there's some action by the governor or one of the other legislative leadership. But things like that are things that just like they pop up and they come through that newsletter. We're also trying to get, we also have an action page linked on there where people can send letters to legislators just asking them to create an independent commission. I mean, I think, Mary will tell you, any legislator you talk to will tell you, like, there's somebody there in their office who's like documenting how many calls they're getting on issues, how many emails they're getting on issues, like, how many times are we getting tweeted at about X issue? Like, this stuff is important. If they hear from you, if we can make enough noise, like, people will pay attention. Finally, we had passed a whole bunch of local resolutions at city councils and county commissioners courts around the state, leading into the prior legislative session. And we need to do that again. We need to do that again because that's actually a really powerful, like, the county commissioners and county judges and mayors and city council members. These are important, influential people that legislators listen to. Like, these are voices that really matter. Like, maybe more than all of us, I don't know, but for sure they are people that they have to work with. They will definitely listen to. So just three quick things, and we'll definitely keep you updated on some more actions going forward. But okay, one question that popped up several times, and this was also in the film. And this is kind of for both of you, I guess. So ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. So there was a big part of the film that talked about how these maps and a lot of like voting rights laws and a bunch of bills in general are drawn behind closed doors by these they're like bill factories. And we saw that in Texas, that the original version of the voter ID bill that eventually got passed originally came from ALEC. This is also a big deal for us because in Texas, the chairperson of the House Redistricting Committee is an officer of ALEC. When several months ago in Austin, when ALEC had their big conference, Phil King, the chair of the committee, was one of the speakers, and it was the things that were talked about behind closed doors, which somehow they let reporters into, which seems to have been a mistake, but there's reporters who got to write about a bit of it. Like, it was not encouraging. None of it was like encouraging, but like oh, these guys really care about voting rights or are really going to be into representation. Like, so I guess the question here is just like, there's a piece of this is like, let's try to win like reforms. But a big piece of it is also like, can we just make this process more transparent? Like, how can we just like make sure that this isn't all happening behind closed doors? And I don't know. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I'm gonna throw it at y'all and hope that you have some smart ideas.
Katie?
I think it looks like Katie is talking, but not. I can't hear it.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Sorry, guys. So in Michigan, we have a couple different things that we tried. So we have an open meetings law that we require the commission to have to follow. The law is weird in general, just like the legislature, unless you like specify it, can choose whether they want to follow it or not. So that's why we made sure it was required of every meeting, which meant that people on the commission, two or more of them couldn't meet together to talk about this. And also any meeting that they are having on the commission is required to have like public notice, and the public has to be invited into it. And we basically put laws to encouraging the use of like video, and this was even before the pandemic, but just how do we make it as easy as possible for people to have access. The other thing that we did is we made it so that all data that is used for redistricting process has to be made available basically immediately. So any map that's run, any types that are run by this committee, because you end up, of course, running a bunch of them, because you want to see what the unintended or the unintended consequences are. I think the film does a really good job of showing just how secretive this process can be in Wisconsin. And I think I remember something about one time having a gerrymandering bunker or something that legislators like went and hid in to draw the map. So I think even just being able to put rules around that, around data, around meetings, and some states, including how we've changed ours, have to the commission member or committee member has to write basically a justification for each district and why it was drawn that way, why they chose to have the lines fall along those borders. And people can always try and like mislead in there, but it provides more evidence where if there's counter, if it doesn't actually line up with the truth, it can be really useful in a court case and getting the map lines redrawn. I'm trying to think. And the other thing is you can try and limit the types of data that is used and is allowed to be used when these maps, so that you know what all the data sets are too.
Yeah. The data is a great point, which raises another question that several people asked about. And it also ties into the believe it or not, the gerrymandering bunker that you just also talked about in the film. I don't remember if it was that example, but like one of the people mentioned as the bad guys of gerrymandering in the film is Thomas Hoffler. And for any of you not familiar, he was like the gerrymandering guru. And also, in a funny twist of fate, like wasn't on good terms with his daughter, I think it was, who ended up like leaving hard drives and hard drives and hard drives of like all of his writings and stuff. She ended up just giving it to like some of the people at Common Cause North Carolina, who have since made a lot of that public, and it's all a lot of crazy stuff. So be nice to your kids, I guess, if you're going to be a gerrymandering bad guy, I guess is the lesson. But one thing about him and the data, like he did, when people started looking through all of his stuff, one of the things he did was specifically in Texas, looked at the maps of the state house and tried to figure out, like, if you drew lines based on citizen voting age population instead of total population, like, what does that do? Mm-hmm. And basically, like, it was obvious, but it was basically his words were something along the lines of like, this advantages Republicans and Anglos. And he was obviously writing this for a Republican audience in the context of like, this would like extend your power for a really long time. And this is not a hypothetical like, oh, that's crazy, nobody would ever do that. That is a thing that people are actively talking about. And I don't know, Mary, if you've had any discussions about this, but I'm just curious if you've heard anything about like efforts to use citizen voting age population to draw maps in Texas in this next round.
I haven't, but that wouldn't surprise me. And so now I think it's on my radar to listen for those kind of conversations. Anthony, I want to go back to something you said about action items, and I know those are your action items. I'm going to add one of my own, just because we don't know what legislative session is going to look like next year because of the coronavirus. What I'm telling people right now, and I want to give a shout out to my El Paso folks who might be watching, our Fair Maps people in El Paso and League of Women Voters in El Paso, because they have been great. We may not be able to have committee hearings the way we traditionally have had them. We may not be, it may be harder to have access to legislators because they might say, well, because of coronavirus, I'm not going to have one-on-one meetings in my office. So right now is a great time for you to build that relationship. And I think this goes to Katie's point about transparency. If you know you have a group of constituents who are watching your every move when it comes to redistricting, you might think twice about doing something bad, right? And so right now, set up in your district, find 10 people, ask for a Zoom meeting, and start to build that relationship and check in every 3 months. Hi, wondering what you're doing on redistricting this month. Hi, what's the last thing you did on redistricting? And really show them that you're watching, show them that you care, build that relationship. I think sometimes people wait until legislative session and they're like, okay, now I'm going to go talk to them. Don't wait. Do it now and do it consistently. Be a squeaky wheel on this. So yes. So Anthony answers no, and then I came up with my own answer.
That's fantastic.
100%.
Well, and you know, I will just like underline that. One thing, it was really interesting. I was recently sending, we're doing what's called the End Gerrymandering Pledge. We send it out to all the legislators and ask them to sign on. But normally, like, it's, you know, a lot of Democrats will respond or sign on, and no Republicans. I got like a really nasty reply from a Republican who I'm not going to name. I'll tell you later, Mary, if you want to know. But like, it was just kind of like, you know, isn't this just about helping Democrats out? And I'd like wrote him back and it's like, you know, actually, like, this is not. This is about like politicians drawing maps to favor themselves, not about parties. And we actually just sent this letter to like Virginia because Democrats were trying to do something bad on redistricting, and like we ended up having a really kind of like, not super friendly or productive, but like a pretty civil back and forth about this, which to me, it was just, I mean, it was interesting. And it was also just like, I feel like this is not a thing that normally happens when we send that type of thing. And I don't know if it's just like right now easier, like if elected officials are just bored and just have more time on their hands like all the rest of us.
Oh yeah,
like,
bored.
more inclined to respond to things, but I don't know, maybe that's the case.
Well, I do think because that's the only way to communicate, maybe we are being more engaged with technology. So again, everybody, don't use this time to connect with your legislators.
Yeah. Okay, we just have a few more minutes left here, but so Katie, a pretty interesting question popped up in the chat here about, so you used to work in the garbage recycling industry. How is it that you became involved in gerrymandering and slaying dragons?
I did. That's true. And I really quick to your last question, I just wanted to say, I think trying to look at just voting population is really dangerous when it comes to redistricting, especially because these lines are often only drawn once every 10 years. And so you are making a decision based on the next decade worth of elections, and you're missing then all of the people who will be turning 18 and able to vote from there on out, even though your decisions are being made on like a snapshot when the maps actually impact the next 10 years worth of elections. Yeah. So really important to keep in mind with any kind of changes we're making. I think also when it comes to any kind of, so who knows what the political parties will look like in 10 years or 20 or 30. So if you're doing like changing laws or amending a constitution, if you're looking out for just Democrats or just Republicans, it's very short-sighted. And you could actually have your own unintended consequences depending on what those parties end up evolving into. For me, I always voted, but I really didn't like the partisan politics. I don't know if it's just because I'm from the Midwest or not, and we just don't talk about that, but I, never really was drawn into the like tribalism or like the extremism, us versus them, the like, we're one country together. but I was paying attention, and there was the emergency manager law, which led to the Flint water crisis. That even as I was driving to work, the political, like our local radio channel covers state level politics, and I was just hearing how you have a legislature making decisions against what people want. And the other part of that law, the loophole that they found in order to reinstate the emergency manager after the voters of Michigan had taken it away, was an appropriations loophole, where basically if they attached even $1 from the budget, then it became citizen veto proof. Citizens were allowed to veto a bill if any money was being spent for it. So then every single law being passed in Michigan had like $1, $5, $100 attached to it, just to make sure the citizens couldn't take it back. And it just felt so wrong to me. And so even though yes, my day was crawling around in dumpsters and like high heels and doing waste audits, helping organizations, people figure out where does your recycling go, where does your waste go, it's still going to work every single day knowing that another Flint water crisis could happen. I felt so powerless looking at a city of thousands of people with thousands of kids who couldn't go to school, couldn't take a shower, couldn't cook without having bottled water. And the only solutions we were getting were, oh, we can send them water. I was like, that's not good enough. We have to make sure that we can prevent any kind of horrific accident like this ever being able to happen again. And that's why I think I had heard and learned about gerrymandering, and I knew that that was probably one of the reasons why you could have a politician who's so unafraid of being elected, because that's really what the attitude was. You're doing things that you knew were unpopular, that people were flooding the streets telling you were unpopular, yet they just weren't even worried about it. And when I was doing or just even listening to the radio commentary, it really came down to, oh, even though, more voters voted this way, why do we still have laws that are really extreme, either towards the left or towards the right? We've had Democrats and Republicans here in our state, depending when it was. You'd have really extreme policy, super left or super right. The majority of people in Michigan are somewhere in the middle. And so I think it just stuck out to me. And then just for like full transparency too, as soon as I made a Facebook post, I was not planning on starting a political movement or amending our state. I actually had to Google, how do you end gerrymandering in Michigan? But we slowly, and I think my recycling credibility, it helped me look at, if you're involved in the environment, you're looking at systems, looking at ecosystems, how do humans interact, and how does the environment impact humans. I think for me, that's kind of where the system approach came. I had a lot of project management and having to design stuff. So I think that's where I probably helped the most. But Google is your friend.
That is fantastic. Well, looks like we have hit the hour. Thank y'all so much, Katie. There are just endless little brilliant tidbits we're definitely going to steal from you, try to apply in Texas, and Mary, just the insight. And I think we came away with a bunch of action items that we're gonna have to talk right after this and figure out how we do a bunch of stuff.
Definitely. And Katie, I'm your biggest fan.
Yes, I'd be happy to help in whatever way. That's why we started thepeople.org, because we want to, there's a ton of us who want to just make sure that every voter in the country can have their vote counted.
Thank you.
That's amazing. We will definitely be in touch. We, the coalition, will definitely be giving you a call. And thank you to everybody for joining us on behalf of the Fair Maps Coalition Participant Media. Thank you all so much. And please go check out some of those action items on the page, and talk to you soon. Thank you all.
Thanks, Anthony. Thank you, everyone.